Bonjour et bienvenue sur 42. Today's video is sponsored by Babble, the #1 language learning app in the world, with more than 10 million subscriptions worldwide. It's often said that the life of a woman in the Middle Ages was pretty tough, thanks to a distinct lack of job opportunities, the unavoidable perils of childbirth, and a general commitment on the part of men towards being in charge of everything. And that's all true. But it's easy to forget, life wasn't exactly a picnic for men either. Sure, they got to have jobs and go hunting and all that sort of thing, but they also faced a lot of pressure. And when I say pressure, I'm not talking about your regular run-of-the-mill, roof over the head and food on the table kind of thing. No, I'm talking about pressure of a rather more sensitive variety. You see, in the Middle Ages, if a woman felt her husband wasn't upholding his end of the bedroom-based bargain in their relationship, he was in for a world of trouble. Now sure, when faced with her husband's malfunctioning manhood, a medieval mistress might simply have patted him reassuringly on the back and told him not to worry, and that this kind of thing happens to everyone. She might have even headed over to the local witch or healer and asked for the medieval equivalent of Viagra. She might have done those things. Or she might have skipped the foreplay and taken her erectionally challenged husband straight to court. Because in the Middle Ages, impotence was a serious matter, and one of the very few reasons for which a woman might divorce her husband. But to do that, she would have to take her case to court, where her man's member would be discussed at length, or not, as the case may turn out to be. As crazy as all that may sound, impotence annulment trials really did take place in the Middle Ages, and some records of the proceedings survive to this day. I love travelling, and the French countryside is always my go-to. However, I often feel rude and sometimes embarrassed by my total inability to understand the language of the locals. So I'm using Babble to learn to speak French. From my experience, language learning apps don't get any better than Babble. Unlike other apps that use algorithms to generate lessons, Babble lessons are created by real people who have vast experience with teaching languages. And you know what? The results speak for themselves. University studies have shown that just 15 hours of Babble is equal to a semester of college Spanish. And that doesn't surprise me, because after just a few days using Babble, I've learned and can recall a long list of French phrases that are actually really useful in conversation. This is because Babble prepares you for situations you will actually encounter in real life. The best thing about Babble is that the lessons are actually engaging and fun, and they've recently added some brand new features that I love, such as language learning games, short stories, podcasts, and culture clips. This keeps Babble lessons exciting and varied, unlike other learning methods that just repeat phrases at you and send you to sleep. What language have you always wanted to learn? Well, you should start today by heading to my link below to get up to 50% off a Babble subscription, plus your first lesson absolutely free for a limited time only. Don't miss it, guys. Okay, so what actually happened at a medieval impotence trial? Well, for starters, let's just say that if you thought people in the Middle Ages were all rather coy, you'd be wrong. Very wrong. If a woman decided to take her allegedly impotent husband to court, the couple would be expected to provide evidence to support their case. As you might expect, the two sides of the story were often told very differently. So, in order to get to the bottom of the matter, an impotence investigation would take place, with the man being subject to a public and rather detailed analysis of the contents of his breeches. To facilitate this investigation, witnesses would be sought to establish exactly what had been going on in the couple's bedroom. Well, I've called them witnesses. Their role was probably more akin to that of a detective. The witnesses might have been medical experts called upon to examine the man, or they might simply have been local people connected to the defendant and the plaintiff who were simply called in to provide an independent view. Records of one such investigation carried out between 1433 and 1434, yes, it really did take that long, provide some interesting insight into the world of medieval impotence trials. Catherine Barley filed for annulment of her marriage to William Barton, claiming he was impotent. But then, no fewer than 13 men came forward to testify as to William's virility, which, if you ask me, puts even more suspicion on the marriage. One man who made a point of telling the court he'd fathered 10 children and was therefore something of an expert on the subject of erections, claimed he had personally seen William Barton's penis and could confirm with some confidence that at time of seeing and touching the aforesaid rod, William's was longer and larger than his own. Other witnesses also compared William's rod to theirs, and several were quite effusive in their praise. One claimed it was 2 handfuls long, and another that William had large and fit testicles and other signs of virility. Again, considering the intimate knowledge so many men seem to have regarding her husband's penis, you should probably think Catherine Barley had rather bigger concerns than her husband's impotence. Several women were called in to examine William's wang, but apparently they were unable to reach a unanimous conclusion as to its usability. Some were just as complimentary as the men had been, whilst others were much less so. One female witness even told the court, "William's rod has no value," which might just be the most damning penis insult I've ever heard. Not that I've heard too many. Unfortunately, we don't know the outcome of this trial, as the rest of the court records have been lost to history, so we only have the witness statements. But given the balance of testimonies in this one, it seems likely the court would have ruled for William rather than his wife. Perhaps her allegation was malicious, or maybe everything she said was true, and the many witnesses who testified for William and his evidently impressive penis were protecting a friend from the shame of being publicly judged impotent. We'll never know for sure, sadly. Other men were not as lucky as William. In the case of Tedia Lamherd and John Sanderson, the court asked 3 women to examine John and report on their findings. Whoever made the first such report clearly wasn't overly worried about hurting poor old John's feelings, because she really didn't hold back in her assessment of the gift God had given him, describing John's penis as an empty intestine of mottled skin that does not have any flesh in it. Keen to give John's member every chance of proving its innocence, another examiner even went so far as to give it a little stroke, but unfortunately her ministrations failed to have the desired effect. As well as testifying to John's lack of virility, witnesses for Tedia also claimed both John and Tedia had admitted they hadn't been able to have sex at all during their 3-year marriage, despite much trying. There were also, tellingly, no children, despite Tedia being a young woman of just 26. Unlike the previous case, we do know the outcome of this one, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the court found in favour of Tedia, and against the empty intestine of mottled skin between John's legs. An annulment was duly granted. Both the cases we've looked at so far were tried in England, but in France, impotence investigations could be even more detailed, not to mention humiliating. A French man accused of impotence would be examined by a team of priests, doctors, and midwives, who would expect him to prove the potency of his penis by summoning up his best erection for all to see, even going so far as to require proof of ejaculation. And if anything on God's green earth is likely to prevent a man from reaching orgasm, it's gathering a large group of people around to watch him try. Unsurprisingly, many of these men were unable to perform under such circumstances. And when they couldn't, they were given two choices. They could accept the findings of the examination, or they could demand a trial by Congress. This involved husband and wife agreeing to meet for some attempted sex at a neutral location in front of an even larger crowd of excited onlookers. It was a bit like the FA Cup final, only with sex instead of football. Amongst the crowd would be the same team of priests, doctors and midwives as had been present the first time around, all of whom, apart from the midwives, would position themselves behind a screen for the duration of the attempt, emerging only to examine the state of the bedsheets when the deed was done. Lovely! It's clear that a lot of time and effort used to go into establishing the guilt or innocence of a man accused of impotence. But what exactly does that tell us about medieval society? First, it's worth acknowledging that impotence trials were generally an indulgence of the wealthy. The cost to the couple of such a legal undertaking has been estimated at several £1,000s in today's money, so it's not something peasants would have been concerning themselves with. It seems impotence trials were a bit like soap operas for the upper classes, whose sex lives were probably avidly dissected in local knitting circles and backstreet taverns. You might be thinking all this graphic talk of sex and genitals is a bit surprising in a society where the Catholic Church still ran pretty much everything, but in reality, it's because of the Church's influence that these impotence investigations took place to begin with. The Church considered it every married couple's religious duty to have sex in order to fulfill their sacred vows. An unconsummated marriage was just as good as slapping God in the face. And once consummated, you were expected to keep on pleasing God and, ideally, create some children whilst you're at it. So, whilst today we would consider impotence a private marital matter, throughout much of history, people would have considered sex and marriage, at least partly, a public matter. Marriage was a public act of faith, after all. The Church really was all important to medieval people, and for the most part, the Church and the state were one and the same. It was therefore quite natural, even inevitable, that people's private and family lives were governed by the Church. The existence of God was unquestionable, as was the importance of fulfilling your duty to the Church. To say the medieval Church was all-powerful isn't quite accurate. It was everything to everyone. Medieval marriages were orchestrated entirely by the Church, much more so than is common today. The Church, therefore, felt perfectly entitled to make sure a married man was doing his duty. An impotent man was considered a failure, and if he were thought to have married, knowing full well he was impotent beforehand, he would also be considered a deceiver and a fraud. Such a man would have married under false pretenses, after all, and would therefore have lied to God as well as his wife. Given the significance of such an act, it's not surprising the medieval court went to such lengths to prove or disprove a man's impotence. It really mattered, and not just to the frustrated wives. But the existence of the impotence trials does not simply demonstrate the dedication of medieval people to the Church and the importance they placed on marriage and children. The fact that people were willing and indeed legally required to examine each other's genitals in public, talk about them in quite graphic terms, and even have sex, or attempt to, with an audience of strangers watching on, is quite contrary to common 21st century perceptions of medieval people and their attitudes. We often think of medieval people as being quite sexually repressed, and in some ways they were. But for the most part, they shared a fairly pragmatic view towards sex, and were prepared to discuss it much more frankly than many people are today, in what is truly a far more sexually liberated period in history. These days, impotence trials are well and truly a thing of the past. But believe it or not, impotence is still considered legal grounds for divorce in several US states. So perhaps we shouldn't laugh too hard at our medieval ancestors after all. Thanks for watching.